Perfect. Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Dr. Perry Maynard, and I'm with Integrated Health Systems. Everyone give me a thumbs up if they can hear. I can see my videos got a little bit of glitches here or there, but I want to make sure that everyone can hear me clearly because that's the most important part. Not that necessarily you can see me. Perfect. Cool. Looks like we got a few thumbs up from some people. So we are going to dive right into it. So thank you so much for everyone taking time out of their busy week to be here and to listen to the topic today. And the topic is the immune system and brain injuries, right? Or why might one's immune system still be causing their persistent post concussive syndrome, right? Or their symptoms. A lot of individuals with brain injuries may go through physical rehabilitation, vision therapy, vestibular rehab, and they may get a lot better, but there still may be some lingering symptoms. And some individuals may change their diet, take supplements, and notice a huge improvement. And you may be asking yourself, why is that the case? And how do we know when the right therapy is for the right person at the right time, really? And that's really the important thing, is that each patient, there's a time frame, and there's a time frame when we need to know when to apply the appropriate strategy in rehabilitation from a traumatic brain injury. So for those of you who are new to these webinars or maybe new to integrated health systems, I'll do a short little thing about myself. Some of you I recognize already, so you already know me. But for those of you who don't know me, so I'm Dr. Perry Maynard. I'm one of the clinicians at Integrated Health Systems and Integrated Brain Centers in Inglewood, Colorado, so just south of Denver. And I specialize in rehabilitation and treatment of individuals suffering from complex neurological disorders. This may include traumatic brain injuries. This may include different types of neuroautoimmune disorders like maybe MS, or maybe suffered an infection that caused neurological symptoms. Maybe they got sick and things came on afterwards. Pretty much kind of like the funky neurological cases where people are struggling, kind of figuring out what's going on. Those are the type of people I see. I also specialize in the treatment of a lot of inner ear disorders. So we work with a lot of people with balance issues, dizziness, vertigo. So that's another big specialty of mine and passion of mine that I treat. Let's see. It looks like we have one person that's having trouble with sound. Um, I'm going to keep going. If other people have trouble with sound as well, please let me know so I can figure that out. Looks like some people are saying sound is okay on their end. So I'll continue through. So yeah, so those are the patients I see. So I see a lot of patients suffering from traumatic brain injuries, some early on in the brain injury process. For the most part, a lot of people months to years afterwards. And I wish I could see people a lot earlier because it would make my job a lot easier, and it would make patients' recovery a lot easier as well. Because when you're dealing with months and years after symptoms have started, you're going to be dealing with a lot of the inflammation and the immune alterations that we're going to talk about tonight. And those can take a lot of work and a lot of time to try to reverse. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about stages, right? So, what even happens from a molecular level in the brain after a brain injury? So, for those of you who are maybe current patients of mine or past patients, you might have heard me talk about really two things happen with a brain injury. One is there is alterations in the connections of the brain. So you go from being high speed internet to AOL dial up, right? If everyone remembers that from the 90s, right? Really slow internet, right? So the connections or the highways or the axons connecting these different networks become sluggish, and they become a little wonky and weird, so that things are functionally, or from a connection standpoint, they're a little bit off, right? And that's where rehab comes into play. We're not going to talk about that today. What we're going to talk about is the metabolic consequences or the immune consequences that happen with a head injury, right? So inflammation, debris. How does your brain handle debris from a traumatic brain injury? How may a past infection like mono or Epstein-Barr virus or things like Lyme disease or mold or hormonal issues, how may those set an individual up for a worse recovery from a traumatic brain injury? Or how may working on hormones and some of those things make a difference with someone recovering from a brain injury? I'm hoping that you'll walk away tonight understanding the mechanisms of why that works, right? And why that's important to look at. So when an individual first hits their head, so we have the acute and the subacute inflammation, okay? So whenever one suffers a traumatic brain injury, there's some sort of movement of the brain within the skull, okay? So the brain rotates or shears back and forth, right? And this creates micro damage, okay? Or what are called DAMPs, okay? DAMPs stand for damage associated molecular patterns, okay? This is just a fancy word for that. When you damage brain tissue, that has a certain molecular pattern or sequence that your immune system recognizes. So very early on in the traumatic brain injury, within hours, right, you have this release of these DAMPs or these damaged tissue. That damaged tissue signals certain parts of the immune system that kick off certain chemicals that cause inflammation. So some of these things are things called TNF alpha or tissue necrosing factor and things like interleukin 6. Some of you, this may be completely foreign language. Others of you may completely know what I'm talking about. Those are two inflammatory molecules. And then for those of you who have been following COVID, those are two molecules that are very important in patients that have negative outcomes with COVID, right? Because they're inflammatory molecules. Now, just because they're inflammatory doesn't mean they're bad. We want to keep them in check. They're a necessary evil that we need, but we need them to be in the right dose. Okay. So early on, we have this increase in inflammation. The other thing we have is an upregulation of what's called the inflammasome. Once again, the inflammasome is getting a lot of attention with coronavirus, and we're realizing with other infections as well. You also see it with traumatic brain injuries, but the inflammasome is full of a bunch of gene sequencing that turns on a bunch of genes to kick off more and more inflammation. Once again, early on, this is okay, but we don't want excessive inflammation. Or once again, if there's maybe already inflammation before you hit your head and there's already increased production of these inflammasomes, you may have an overreaction. Okay. So the first thing we see is inflammation. Okay. The next thing we see is what's called glutamate excitotoxicity. Okay. So within your brain, you have different neurochemicals. You have some that are inhibitory, some that are excitatory. So things that slow down the brain and things that excite the brain. Okay. Whenever you have a traumatic brain injury, you get a huge influx of excitatory neurotransmitters, especially glutamate, into the cell. Okay. And there's a relationship between glutamate and calcium. So you get this huge influx of glutamate into the cell, which makes cells very hyper-excitable. Okay, so all of a sudden cells, you can think of it from a standpoint of RPMs. Say a cell's resting state should be at 1,000 RPMs. After a brain injury, let's say it goes to 10,000 RPMs. So it's just oscillating way too fast at a very unhealthy state. Okay, that is the glutamate excitotoxicity. So we can see we have the large influx of chemicals. Those activate what are called NMDA and AMPA receptors. Those receptors are all over the brain and they have to do with stimulating the brain. So a lot of medication for seizures or things to calm down the brain actually target NMDA and AMPA receptors. So some of you may be saying, well, how do we shut those down after a brain injury? Can that help? And the research still isn't completely clear on how effective that is, because those also help with plasticity. So they help with building new connections. So what I want to instill into you is it's all about the right timing. Everything can be good and everything can be bad if it's at the inappropriate timing or goes on too long. Okay. And then the last thing with the glutamate excitotoxicity is that there becomes impaired clearance. So astrocytes are certain cells in your brain that help to clear glutamate, and there becomes alterations in that. So your brain becomes really hyperexcitable. And this is where you can see things like sound sensitivity, light sensitivity, anxiety, things where people are wound up, or they get really anxious and then they fatigue out really quickly. So you can see that the energy state in the brain is very fragile. That's largely that glutamate excitotoxicity. Okay. The next two things are mitochondrial dysfunction and vascular injury. When we look at mitochondrial dysfunction, for those of you who are unaware of what mitochondria are they are the powerhouses of the cell. So they help with producing energy from things like glucose, fats, proteins, things like that. Okay, so they're very, very important for neuronal health or brain health. So when we have a brain injury, what happens is it alters the way the mitochondria looks and functions. Right. And then this causes the immune system to say, I don't recognize that and I don't like that. I'm going to start attacking that and chewing that up because that's inefficient. Once again, we need to clear the debris after a head injury. But if we don't stop the clearance of debris at a certain point, that's when things don't turn out very well, right? Or we can lead to things like neurodegeneration, okay? And then we have vascular injury. So we know we get increased permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Why can this be bad, right? Certain things going on in the periphery, inflammation, infections, things like lipopolysaccharides from the gut, right? Some of you may be familiar with those. Those can now seep into the brain, right? So there's a lot of theories that the brain should be immune naive, right? It should be separate from the periphery or the rest of your body's immune system. But when you have a traumatic brain injury, that doesn't happen. You get this increase or this permeability that now allows cells from the outside in, right? And we may not want these cells in. There's some ideas that it can be helpful, and there's others that it can be very detrimental. Okay, so those are the big four stages that occur when one is suffering from, sorry, actually hit my computer, from a traumatic brain injury. Okay. So, like we talked about, inflammation is a big key, right? And we have three big things we want to think about, what are called DAMPs, PAMPs, and HAMPs. Kind of funny words. So, DAMPs, remember, are the damage associated molecular patterns. Okay. So, when tissue gets damaged, that gets presented to the immune system so you can clear that debris. You also have what are called PAMPs, which are pathogen associated molecular patterns. So when you get an infection, that has a certain pattern that your immune system recognizes so it can clear it and get it out of your system. And then you have what are called HAMPs, which is any alteration in homeostasis. Homeostasis means balance. So any alterations in blood sugar, electrolytes, stress chemistry can stimulate HAMPs. So these three things can be big stimulators of the immune system. Why do I bring this up? Because if you have multiple head injuries, you're increasing the amount of damaged tissue. That's not a good thing. If you have underlying infections, you're increasing immune reactivity, especially if those infections work their way into the brain, which they can after a head injury. And then if you have things like altered blood sugar, altered electrolyte imbalances, poor stress chemistry, meaning that cortisol is off, sleep hormones are off, those are also going to activate the immune system in a way that you may have an overreaction when you suffer a brain injury, right? So that's where we talk about pre-existing things can be very, very important. Okay. So quickly, we'll look how that kind of system works. And this is kind of a refresher from a past webinar I did on the immune system, right? So whenever you have these DAMPs, PAMPs, or HAMs, right, whatever these molecular patterns that your immune system has to recognize, right, your innate immune system, right, or what are called dendritic cells or antigen presenting cells, grab a hold of that debris, okay? They move into the bloodstream, they go into our lymph nodes where they present that to the immune system, okay? And now the immune system has a really difficult job. It has to decide, is that foreign tissue? Is that damaged human tissue? Or is that healthy tissue, right? Because if you damage tissue, you're bound to take healthy tissue with it, right? You're not going to just pick up damaged tissue. So your immune system has to be able to recognize that this is happening. When this goes well, we get an appropriate immune response. When this doesn't get well, the handoff between the two arms of the immune system, what's called the innate and the adaptive immune system, when that doesn't go well, that's when we get things like autoimmunity. right? And we know that traumatic brain injuries can increase the likelihood of development of neuroautoimmune disorders. I have patients currently that I'm seeing now that have developed neuroautoimmune disorders after a head injury, right? And most likely it goes back to this mechanism and alterations in the immune system. Okay. And one big thing that plays a really big role in this working smoothly is actually vitamin D. Right. So everyone talks about vitamin D. You got to have your vitamin D up really high. And a lot of people don't really know why. And there's a whole gamut of reasons. But one of the big things is vitamin D or adequate vitamin D levels helps with the handoff or the function of these antigen presenting cells. So it allows that handoff between the innate and the adaptive immune system to go a little bit smoothly, right? And this might be why we see increased prevalence of autoimmune disorders in individuals with lower vitamin D. It's not that vitamin D is causing it, it's just making the whole system not work as well. So it increases our likelihood. Okay. So now let's talk about what happens next. Okay. The cleanup crew. So I use this analogy with patients sometimes. I can't remember, I think I got it from another doctor at one point. So within your brain, you have a cleanup crew. Okay. You have the janitors of the brain. The janitors of the brain are what are called microglia. In the periphery or the rest of the immune system, they're what are called macrophages. Okay. So macrophages have different names when they're in different tissues of the body. When they're in the brain, they're called microglia. Okay. And these are the janitors. They're the cleanup crew. They clean up debris and they help with the whole immune response. Okay. So whenever you have a brain injury, you could think of it like your brain threw a party, right? It threw a frat party and you made a mess. And now the cleanup crew or the microglia have to come clean it up. And then they might have to repair some things. They might have to repair the floorboards. You might need new paint, right? But all these things should happen at different frequencies. You don't just come in and start fixing the floor. You got to clean the cups off the ground. You got to mop. You got to clean, and then you have to repair, right? So these are the microglia, okay? And microglia make up 5 to 20% of the brain, right? So they're a big portion of the brain and neurons, okay? Normally, they should be in a rested state. So they shouldn't really be active. They should just be scanning the environment, not really doing anything, okay? But during an injury, inflammation, stress, or infection, they become activated, or what some people call primed. Okay. So the microglia turn on. Now you had a party, and the microglia say, hey, we got to rush to the site of injury, or we have to go to the address where this party happened, and we need to start clearing up. Okay. And to keep things simple, we really have two types of microglia. We have what are called M1 microglia, and we have what are called M2 microglia. Okay. And the difference between the two is that M1 microglia are induced by those DAMPs, PAMPs, and HAMPs we talked about, right? So when inflammation occurs, this causes the microglia in the rested state to turn into M1, right? So they can kind of like shapeshift. They can go from M1 to M2 and back and forth, okay? So M1 is more responsible for inflammation, okay? It can be neuroprotective in the short term, but there's a lot of theories and a lot of the research is theorizing that the M1 microglia, when it doesn't shut off, is largely behind things like CTE, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, pretty much any neurodegenerative disorder. There's some theory that microglia play a role, and that M1 microglia, or the imbalance between M1 and M2 microglia, is behind it, right? We don't know this for certain, but that's some of the theories out there, okay? So we know that when neutrophils or different immune cells rush into the brain, this causes you to cause more M1. Okay, so once again, everything in the entire body doesn't work as simple as maybe a lot of doctors or a lot of functional medicine makes it seem of inflammation's bad, anti-inflammation's good, right? There's a balance, and we need a synergy between the two, right? You want to be able to have the M1 response. You want neutrophils and things to come into the tissue so you can clean up, but we need resolution of that, right? Same thing that you see in, cancers or things like that is you need both types of M1 and M2 because they do different things, right? So when you get polarization of one more than the other, that's when things get dangerous, right? Homeostasis, we want balance, okay? And the M1 usually peaks about 20 to 25 days after injury. And this is kind of my personal thought why you may see some individuals where they have a head injury. First week, they're doing pretty good. And then a month later, they're doing terrible and they're getting worse and worse and worse. And my thought is that could it be that this M1 microglia system is just ramping up, and isn't shutting off? And so you're seeing more and more inflammation build up. That's one idea. That could be multiple. Okay. And then we have the M2 microglia. Okay. And the M2 microglia are associated with healing and anti inflammation. So they're literally two polar opposite things. M1, inflammation. M2, anti inflammation and healing. Right. Back to my initial analogy, whenever you have a party in the house, you have to clean up. That's the M1. The M2 now is, now that things are cleaned up, you now need to repair the house. Right. But if you just keep cleaning, and you never repair things, that's when things aren't great, right? So they're both very important, and they're both associated with different types of neural signaling or immune chemical signaling. Okay. And M2 microglia spike around day 7. Okay. So once again, we can start to see timing is everything. And we may or may not want to do a ton with anti-inflammatories at certain stages, right? Because we want inflammation to occur, but we need it to subside at a certain point. Okay. So what are our goals from a metabolic standpoint when it comes to a traumatic brain injury? So these are the goals I think about. One, we have to reduce neuroinflammation. Okay. And we'll talk about how some ways that that's done. Okay. We want to reduce excitotoxicity in the brain. We want to reduce T cell and monocyte migration from the periphery. So that's a lot of jargon there, I know, but that's where we talked about where that blood brain barrier opens and reactive immune cells from the rest of my body move now into the brain, right? We want to limit that from happening because that can drive autoimmune disorders, right? So you can see step 4, reduce development of brain autoimmunity. Okay. And then step 5, we want to balance microglial cells and microglial cell activity. Okay. So you think about, those are 5 goals that you really want to think about. And we're going to talk about nutrients and different things that can do them. We're not going to talk heavily about medications. There are a lot of medications that are researched, but we don't use meds in our clinic. Not doesn't mean there's not a time and a place for them. We just use more herbal things, diet, more natural things to try to achieve these things. But there's definitely a time and place for medications, right? So there's research on both nutraceuticals and also pharmaceuticals. Okay. So, what do we do about inflammation and microglial priming? Okay, so looking at inflammation, step 1, or one of the biggest steps, is fix sources of inflammation coming from elsewhere or in the body. And we'll mention what those things are. This is probably going to sound repetitive for a lot of you, but inflammation in other areas of the body, joints, your gut, your sinuses, your lungs, your skin, all these other areas can increase inflammation in the brain. So, once again, maybe you haven't had a head injury, but you're diabetic and you have some other autoimmune disorders. Now is the time to get the hang on those, because the better you can manage those, say, God forbid something happens and a head injury does occur, you're doing things to improve the likelihood that you have a better response and maybe someone who didn't take those right steps. Okay. So body inflammation is a big, big key. Okay. And then this is where things like curcumin and resveratrol can come into play. So once again, people talk about curcumin, resveratrol, all these things all the time, and they can be really great nutrients, but we need to understand when to use them and what they're actually doing. Because if we don't understand that, we're going to maybe use them at a time and say, these don't work, but maybe it's because you're not using them for the right mechanism. Okay. So these things inhibit what's called STAT3 and NF kappa B. So STAT3 is a transcription factor, which all that means is it turns on a sequence of genes, and it's very associated with certain immune cells that drive autoimmune disorders and drive further inflammation. So curcumin and resveratrol help downregulate gene transcriptions for inflammation, right? That's a big way that they work. Okay. And then vitamin D and vitamin A, making sure that those status, adequate vitamin A and vitamin D status, is really important from a standpoint of inflammation. So those are some simple ways. Those aren't the only ways, but some simple ways that we go about it. clinically. And then the inflammasome. Okay, how do we address the inflammasome, or what are some ways to address the inflammasome? Okay, and this holds true even with certain infections along with traumatic brain injuries, but this is largely where things like NAD precursors. Some of you may be familiar with NAD. It's kind of like the new hot molecule in the anti-aging and regenerative medicine world. And I think it can be pretty powerful, but we need to know when to use it, right? Because there is some research showing that cancer cells can use it, so we need to know when to use it and the appropriate timing of how to use it. But NAD precursors and adequate NAD levels helps with reducing inflammasome production. So we use clinically a lot of precursors, so things like NR or nicotinamide riboside or NMN. Um, you can do NAD IVs. We're actually looking to bring someone on to start doing IVs, hopefully in the near future, and we'll be doing IV NAD. There's a lot of debate between experts in the anti-aging world of kind of the efficacy between precursors versus IV. Some love and swear by it, and there's some research to support it, and then others like more precursors. So there's a lot of debate between the two, but we're looking to be able to offer all three in the clinic for these type of cases. So NAD precursors, things like quercetin. And then this is also, once again, where resveratrol fits in, because resveratrol is what is called a sirtuin activator. So we also have what are called the sirtuin genes, which are also a very big gene in the anti-aging world. They do a ton with turning on pathways that help with longevity and aging. Okay, so resveratrol works via activating SIRT1, which helps to downregulate inflammasome production. Okay, so NAD, quercetin, and resveratrol help with lowering the inflammasome. This is also largely where things like fasting and calorie restriction, but also exogenous ketones can come into play. Okay, so the production of ketones help to decrease inflammasome production, and then fasting and calorie restriction increase what's called cyclic AMPK, which is an enzyme in the liver that kind of says, hey, things aren't great right now. And that also helps to reduce the inflammasome. So this is where fasting and ketosis can fit into a brain injury, right? And there's a lot of research looking at efficacy of ketosis in brain injuries. Okay. And then we want to reduce M1 polarization and increase Th2 activation, or increase M2 polarization. Now, once again, we want to make sure we're doing this at the right time. We don't want to be doing this too early. But if you have an individual who's months after a head injury or years after a head injury, there's no reason that they should be stuck in an M1 polarization. They shouldn't be still cleaning up. They should have already cleaned up. They should be healing, right? So usually in the first month, you want to be careful, the first few weeks, careful about doing a ton, throwing a ton of things in if you don't know what you're doing. Later on, you should have shifted out of that. So that's important to know. So when we look at reducing M1 polarization, this is where things like berberine, metformin, and then fasting can play a role, because those increase AMPK activation. Once again, AMPK is an enzyme in the liver that has to do with energy status. So AMPK is activated when the body thinks that there's not enough energy there. This kicks off a ton of longevity pathways and helps to reduce that M1 polarization. Okay. And then we want to increase M2 polarization. And this is done largely from a natural standpoint using berry antioxidants, using polyphenols, and different plant compounds to shift this, right? And there's a lot of study on different drugs, things like steroids, corticosteroids, and other medications that have a similar effect and create more of a M2 polarization, or more of a healing polarization. So there's research on medications and nutraceuticals. Okay. This is a really cool paper from the paper you can see below that's cited. Really cool paper if people want to read more on this topic we're talking about. But this is a cool picture looking at the M1 and the M2 states. And once again, it's a very busy photo, but that's where you can see where certain medications and then certain nutraceuticals fit in. So you can see resveratrol at the bottom is a PDE inhibitor. You can see luteolin and all these different things and how they actually fit in from a gene standpoint with shifting those things. And I know I saw a question. I'm going to answer questions at the end, so hang in there with me. I shouldn't have much more to talk about. Looks like sound issues. Okay. Are other people having sound issues as well? I know I just had someone say they were having some sound issues. Give me a thumbs up if you're able to hear. Okay. So it looks like most people can still hear. Okay. So I'm going to keep chugging along. Once again, this is going to be recorded. And if the sound is a little shoddy after we record it, I can always re record it and for better sound quality. So if you're not catching everything now, you'll be able to watch this at your own pace at a later date as well. Okay. Okay. So, how do we reduce excitotoxicity? Okay. One of the big ways that we do this more naturally is using things like magnesium glycinate. Okay. So, mag glycinate is used to plug up the NMDA receptor in the AMPA receptor. So, it keeps calcium from rushing into the cell, allowing excessive glutamate to come into the cell as well. So, magnesium glycinate can be used to calm down excitotoxicity. You want to be cautious with excessive amounts of glutamine early on in a traumatic brain injury because you don't want to drive that excitotoxicity. You also want to be careful about excessive calcium early on because those two things possibly could drive even more excitotoxicity. And then we want to limit oxidative stress from the excitotoxicity. So we want to limit things like excessive exercise. Exercise is powerful, but there's people, myself included, who are guilty of maybe exercising a little bit to excess. That right, and that can create a little bit more inflammation. Okay, and then also stress chemistry and excessive stress. Okay, this is where things like glutathione, alpha lipoic acid, and N-acetylcysteine fit in, is they help to reduce oxidative stress. So you can see all of these nutrients do different things, right? And that's why not just one nutrient is going to fix one's brain injury. You have to look at a protocol, and I don't like saying protocol because every person's different, but you have to look at a wide variety of tactics to calm as many things down as possible. It's kind of like Dale Bredesen's analogy with Alzheimer's is you have 36 holes in the roof. You have to plug up as many as possible to give you the best fighting chance of feeling better. Plugging up one or two of them is probably not going to make a huge difference. Okay. Okay. And then one of the last points we're going to talk about is brain frequency and firing. So I think this is really interesting when I read some of the research in regards to this. Is that whenever you have a head injury, and let's say you damage your frontal lobe, okay, your areas you damage are going to decrease in frequency of firing. So what that means is they're going to oscillate a little bit slower, right? So this goes back to that connectivity piece. If your brain's not communicating well, what happens is your microglia start expressing what's called an MHC2 complex. Don't worry about what that means. It's just a receptor on the outside of a cell, but MHC2 complexes are what you see when you present a pathogen. So, why this can be problematic is that why would you want to present a receptor that you present with a foreign invader? This is one of the theories of the mechanisms behind brain autoimmunity after traumatic brain injury. What's really fascinating is that they've seen that when you improve the frequency of firing of these circuits that are damaged, you decrease the expression of that MHC2 complex on immune cells, which theoretically could decrease the odds of neuroautoimmunity. So, what does that mean? That means rehabbing your brain and improving the function of damaged areas of your brain. So, if your damaged area is your frontal lobe, doing things to improve function there. If your area is damaged to your cerebellum and your balance centers, exercising those things and getting those regions stronger will actually make your immune system work better. This is really cool to show that the rehab we do can also affect the immune system. So it's not just about just giving nutrients or ketogenic diet, you also need a rehab program. They all need to be done together. And then, of course, you want to make sure you stabilize blood sugar and get rid of any type of anemias or things that can compromise blood flow to the brain. And this is where things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, I think, can be very powerful, is that they improve oxygenation and firing of different brain regions. Okay. So, to kind of summarize, when we talked about body inflammation, blood sugar alterations, chronic stress and overtraining, poor sleep, environmental pollutants, especially right now for those of you who are in Denver, our air quality is quite poor. That can also drive inflammation in the brain as well. Okay. Hollow space dysbiosis, any inflammation in the gut, the lungs, the sinus, the mouth, all can drive brain inflammation. The mounting amount of evidence on the sinus microbiome and the oral microbiome and things like Alzheimer's is pretty fascinating. It's a little scary, but it's kind of cool. Looking at things like periodontal disease, gingivitis, sinus infections, and they're finding these microbes in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease. We don't really know how they get there, but we know that there's some sort of connection between the two. Okay. And then, of course, things like anemia and hypoxia. So, once again, you want to get these things dialed in so that you can make yourself more bulletproof in case you do knock your noggin. Or, once again, if you have hit your head and you're not recovering, you need to make sure that these things are all being addressed either by your doctor or whoever your provider is that's helping you recover. You have to plug up as many of those 36 holes as possible. Okay. The more you leave on the table, you may not be getting as good a results as you deserve, right? So that's why we try to look at as many of these as possible. And then some lab markers. And this isn't all the lab markers you can look at. There's a lot we look at. But from an inflammatory standpoint, we want to look at things like CRP, homocysteine, ferritin, things like TGF beta, and then things like glyca A, right? Those are all really good measurements of inflammation, and they're kind of give you an idea of interleukin 6 levels and some of these TNF alpha levels, right? Because measuring cytokines and immune chemicals is really difficult and is really not that accurate because they're so short lived or because they're in the lymph nodes and not really in the brain or in the blood, I should say. So that's where some of these other molecules give us a little bit better window with some more accuracy of inflammatory processes going on. Okay. And to finish up and to wrap up, to kind of just reiterate and review triggers we need to look at: inflammation, foods, reactions to foods, chronic stress. I know we talk about this all the time, but it's so important. Environmental toxins. Once again, air pollution. I don't feel like a lot of people talk about that. Poor water quality, mold, and other environmental toxins all can drive that M1 polarization. If you're already stuck in an M1 polarization and you live in a moldy house, you have bad air quality, you're eating crummy, you're not getting good sleep, you are just causing more M1 polarization possibly, and that's just driving even more inflammation and probably hindering recovery more and more and more. That's why we have to dial all of these things in. Okay. And then finally, chronic and acute infections. This is another big thing that I feel like a lot of people don't look into or talk about. Different viral, bacterial, parasitic infections. So old mono infections, old herpes infections, uh, tick-borne illnesses, cytomegalovirus, right? There's so many different things, right? And we're constantly having to coexist with infections. But if that inflammatory burden from that infection becomes too much, so maybe you've had mono in the past and you're keeping it at bay, and then a stressful event happens, you kind of lower your immune function. That viral infection becomes more of a burden to you. That creates more inflammation, that creates more brain inflammation, and that makes your recovery from a brain injury that much harder. Or it may flare your concussion symptoms. Some people feel great and then they're like, yeah, I got sick and then my concussion symptoms came back, right? Or I've had patients where they get sick and their concussion symptoms go away, right? And to me, that means there's something going on from an immune standpoint, right? So this is an evolving science, and we're learning so much every day. But I think it's really important that we look at it from both of these sides. So I hope this is helpful, especially for individuals, because sometimes they get told, eat this food, take this supplement. and they sometimes wonder, why am I doing this? Or what is this really doing? So my goal today is to give you more knowledge to understand why these things might be done, right? Whether we're doing them or another practitioner, you can start becoming empowered and say, oh, okay, I'm taking this to work on decreasing my inflammasome. And maybe I'm taking this to increase my M2 polarization, right? And you can start looking at each tactic that you're using and how that fits into your strategy to get better, because everything has a different role. So I hope that was helpful for everyone. Um, to wrap up, like I say, every webinar is it's important to act sooner rather than later, right? The longer these things go untreated, like we said, the longer that M1 polarization occurs, the more damage gets done, right? And we see this with football players and CTE and things like that. But on another note, it's also never too late. So that's important. A lot of individuals think, well, I've had this for 5 years, it's too late, there's nothing that can be done. That's not true. There's always something that can be done. Okay. And then the last is that we do offer free consultations. So if you're curious if you think we'd be a good fit, we can always sit down, talk about your case, and decide whether we'd be a good fit or there may be another avenue that may be better for you. So that's something that we offer as well. Okay. And then if you're in the Denver area and you want to hear us on the radio, we talk about these topics all the time. So you can find either myself, Dr. Stedman, or Jake Mondays at 12:30 on KLZ, Haystack Radio. If you want to learn more about what we do and hear a little bit more about our clinic. So and then the other thing is we also offer telehealth, especially during the coronavirus epidemic. A lot of people are concerned about coming to the office. So there's still a lot we can do via telehealth, whether you're in Denver and you don't want to come in or whether you're in another state. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Like I said, I'm Dr. Perry Maynard with Integrated Health Systems. This webinar will be recorded and it will be put onto another platform where you can watch this at any time. You can fast forward, you can rewind, you can do whatever you want. So you will have access to this probably in a few weeks. So thank you so much for everyone joining. I'm going to open this up to anyone who has any questions now. No problem. Of course, Allison. Cool. Well, if there aren't any other questions, or if you think of some questions at a later state, feel free to call the office and we can always chat. Let's see, here we go. Actually, we got a question. How do you make a determination of status of your brain? So that is a great question. And there's not a simple answer. So there's a multitude of ways. So the way we do it is one is so taking kind of a detailed inventory, right, of symptoms. So symptoms initially help us kind of get an idea of maybe some regions of the brain that may not be working. Okay. And from there, we do a ton of different diagnostic testing. So, us personally, will do a lot of balance testing. We'll do a lot of inner ear testing, visual testing, cognitive assessment, examination pretty much of as many areas of the brain as we can. And then that can give us a window into areas of the brain that are functioning appropriately and then areas that aren't functioning appropriately. So then maybe we find a region or multiple regions that don't look like they're doing so well. Then what we do is we'll run certain labs that are custom for that patient's case or that makes sense. So maybe looking at certain inflammatory molecules or looking for different infections or toxin exposures. And those are all things that we gain from the history. So the history really helps to drive further testing. So it's a mix of testing and then a mix of lab work. And then that can give you a really good idea of inflammatory status, infection status, but then we can have a ton of objective markers of how well is your brain working so that when a plan is created, we can go back and remeasure those things and see, are they improving with the strategy that we're creating? Okay. So I hope that that answers the question, is that there's definitely ways, but it's different for everyone. And everyone really needs a comprehensive approach. Okay. Here we go. We got another question here. Was doing okay after 3 years after a TBI. Then COVID nearly took me out. now have pericarditis and POTS, developed Hashimoto's, and TBI symptoms have returned. Can these be altogether treated? Fabulous question. And yes. Now, is it easy? No. But this is where you can see kind of an example of what we talked about of, you know, a TBI doing okay. There may be still some alterations in the immune system. And then you take something like COVID, like we've talked about, which, one of the scary aspects of COVID is that we know that there's 13 different human tissues within the body that are now being recognized that can cross react with COVID. What does that mean? That means that the infection looks a lot like thyroid tissue, brain tissue, heart tissue, right? All these different tissues, so that when your immune system goes to, remember, present that DAMP or that PAMP, it now starts to attack human tissue, right? So that could have possibly kicked off some of the autoimmune disorders um, that we see. So yes, those can be, but that's where we have to do things to treat the immune system, calm down inflammation, do all these things to calm your body from attacking itself, and then sometimes that helps. And other times, then that's where you have to work on then rehabbing those areas, especially with POTS. And if you're interested, I did a presentation on dysautonomia and POTS a few weeks ago that should be listed on our Vimeo account. So if you want to watch that, I talk a lot about POTS and the immune system and how that can happen. So unfortunately, what you're presenting with is a majority of the patients we see, TBIs that kick off autoimmune disorders or infections that create TBIs. And to answer your question, those things can definitely be treated and managed. They may just have to be done at certain stages and things like that. So if you're curious to kind of talk more about that, feel free to call the office, and we always can set up a time to chat more about the case and answer some more questions you have. But those definitely can be treated, and you should definitely seek someone who can work with those things. So hopefully you don't have to deal with those, or you can manage them well. So I hope that that answers the question. Okay. Cool. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank everyone again so much for taking time out of their busy day. I really appreciate that. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. So, thank you all for joining. I hope you were able to take something out of this for either yourself or a loved one. I hope this was empowering for you. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. You have a great week, and I will see you guys soon on the next webinar in a few weeks. Have a good one.